Welcome back to the show. We're talking about Mexico's drug cartels and the ongoing violence that's left tens of thousands of people dead in the last decade. Joining me now from Mexico City is Alejandro Ope. He is an independent Mexican security analyst. He's held positions with Mexico's intelligence agency as well. Also joining us here in the studio is Duncan Wood. He is director of the Mexico Institute at the Washington, D.C.-based Wilson Center. Welcome to both of you to the show. Alejandro, let me start with you. Mexico's president said there is progress combating these drug cartels, but we heard a very different view just a moment ago from Anabel Hernandez, who said there has been no progress, that the fight continues and that that they've enjoyed very little success. What is your view?
Well, I'm probably somewhere in the middle. There has indeed been most of the major drug cartels that existed a decade ago are probably no longer there, or at least no longer there in the same form as they were. We are moving rapidly from a situation where the criminal underworld was dominated by large-scale drug trafficking organizations connected to the international market to a situation that is far more complex, where you have far many more gangs, probably more local in nature, less sophisticated, but more dedicated to activities such as extortion, kidnapping, theft. The problem indeed is not solved by any metric, but indeed it has changed in nature.
What is your view, Duncan? As we just heard, the nature of the problem may be changing, but is it still as dangerous as it used to be? Is it still as deadly?
We have to put things in context here. Let's remember that amongst Latin American nations, Mexico has one of the lowest homicide rates of all. Let's remember that cities like Mexico City have a lower homicide rate than Washington, D.C. That's part of the important context we have to place here. However, there are parts of Mexico which are extremely dangerous, and the people who live in those areas suffer a great deal from it. The progress that's been made, as I see it, over the past few years is in part what we see from what Alejandro has said, which is disrupting the activities of the cartels. What we haven't seen, however, is really any real strengthening of institutions, particularly at the state and local level, that are able then to resist and to fight back against violence when it bursts out. What we have seen is some isolated success stories, places like the city of Tijuana, Ciudad Juarez, Monterrey, where you've seen government, the private sector, and civil society coming together to really recapture public spaces. But in places like Guerrero, where this recent trouble has taken place, in places like Tamaulipas, in Michoacán, we've seen that same kind of cooperation across the three levels of government and within the local community doesn't exist, and it's led to much higher levels of violence in recent times.
Alejandro, to what extent is corruption making this problem even worse? Anabel Hernandez made the point that there is corruption at very high levels in Mexico. She included governors, mayors, senators in government as well. I mean, how big is the problem?
Well, the problem is quite significant. You look at, say, the rankings of Transparency International. There is indeed a major problem with systemic corruption in Mexico. The issue, however, is far more salient at the local and state level, where you have in some cases pretty much the capture of the state apparatus by criminal gangs. That is what we saw in the last few weeks in the state of Guerrero, particularly in a town named Iguala. But again, that is a very, very serious, probably more serious concern than the high-level corruption that was probably more dominant a decade ago than it is today. Because at that level, the impact on the daily life of people is far more acute than when you had corruption to just allow drugs to pass from one point to the other. What you have here is this weakening of state institutions at the local level that is really making life very difficult for many Mexicans.
So, Duncan, we have a situation where we have all this violence taking place in Mexico because of the drug issue, all these people being killed very violently. Let's look across the border in the United States here. We heard in our report from Frank Contreras there that there is cooperation now between the United States and Mexico. There's intelligence sharing and things like that. But what about the U.S. being the biggest market for Mexico's drugs? I mean, what efforts is the U.S. government making to reduce demand?
Well, this is in part what is driving the cooperation between Mexico and the United States, which is this concept of shared responsibility. Yes, Mexico has a problem of these drugs being produced and transported through Mexico to the United States, but the United States is, of course, the source of the problem in the sense that that's where the demand is. And what we haven't seen is any really sustained effort, or rather any sustained successful effort, to reduce consumption and demand in the United States. Recent efforts in various U.S. states to legalize or decriminalize marijuana, some people have said could be part of the solution. And it's possible. The problem is that marijuana represents such a small percentage of the profits of the drug cartels. The really high-value products for them are things like cocaine, methamphetamines, heroin, as we saw in the report. That, unless you're willing to actually do something to really reduce demand in those areas, we're stuck with this problem for the foreseeable future. And so we really have to be a little bit more inventive. It can't just be just say no. It can't be prohibition. We have to start re-educating people and educating people about the real risks to their health from drug consumption.
And we've seen a very good model in the anti-tobacco drive, right?
Absolutely. I think that the success we've seen across the developed world over the past 30 years is extraordinary. I mean, when you and I were children, everybody smoked. And now it's quite rare to find people smoking, particularly in public.
Alejandro, what steps do you think Mexico needs to take to get these cartels under control? And that would be just beyond law enforcement. What about changes to the judicial system, for one?
Well, I mean, there needs to be changes and broad-based reform across the security and justice sector. There has been an effort to transform the criminal justice system since the constitutional reform in 2008. That reform is proceeding at a heterogeneous pace across the country. You actually need to change the criminal justice, not one criminal justice system, but 30 in each of the 32 Mexican states. So in some states you're seeing real progress in that regard. Places like Chihuahua, places like Baja California, but in others are laggards indeed. And there are some areas where you need to see far more rapid progress. I would argue that prosecutorial capabilities are one very weak link in the justice chain. Mexican prosecutors have a problem transforming intelligence into evidence that can hold its own in a court of law. You also need to transform the prison system, which is it's a mess with some exceptions. So there needs to be indeed broad-based reform across the system. Policing is also an area where you need to have far more creative, far more inventive efforts at transforming some of these institutions.
And Duncan, what kind of connections do these drug cartels have inside the United States? Because there is some evidence to tell us that a lot of the weapons they get actually are from the U.S. side of the border.
Absolutely. It's very clear that there is a healthy, or rather unhealthy, sick flow of drugs, of drugs northwards, and then we see the weapons flowing southwards. By some estimates, as many as 80% of the weapons that are used by organized crime in Mexico originate in the United States, and a lot of those weapons are bought from gun stores and gun shows within a few miles of the U.S.-Mexico border. And that's a real problem there, is that it's not that this is the cause of the violence, but it fuels the violence. And what it does is it makes it extra difficult for local authorities and even federal authorities in Mexico to actually counteract the firepower that these organized crime groups have.
Gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us. And that's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CCTV America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show for that matter, or chat with us on Twitter at CCTV America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.